Ever love you. He teaches on Tuesday nights. What's the class that you teach?
The standing interval class.
Yeah, and what time does it start?
5:30.
Perfect. Dr. R is sort of like my personal Dumbledore. I don't know if but he is so intelligent and always gives little bits of wisdom even when you're not expecting it. So thank you for coming in and talking with us today. Dr. R teaches in the kinesiology department in exercise phys, so he's a very talented, smart guy. Dr. R, take it away.
All right, thank you for showing up today. So today what I want to talk a little bit about are some of the effects of sedentary behavior. And you've probably heard this meme floating around on the internet or in the media talking about sitting is the new smoking. How many people have heard that? Yeah, so you've probably heard about that before. And we all know about smoking. I don't think I have to tell anybody in the room that smoking is not good for you. And so the question is sitting really that bad? And so there's been a lot of information, especially in the last few years, coming out talking about that. And so we want to take a look at that in a little bit more detail. So what got me interested in this was just recently, in fact it was just this past December, there was this article on the front page of the LA Times. All right? And you can see it says, even for the active, a long sit shortens life and erodes health. And this particular article caught my attention because what it's saying is that even if you're regularly exercising and you spend most of the day sitting around, this could be a problem. All right, and so that was something that I think that was a little bit newer information and sort of got me going. I said maybe this would be a good thing for a talk and to look at in more detail. So before we get into sitting specifically, I want to give you just a very brief background on physical inactivity in general and then lead into that. And so there were several key studies that were looking at the relationship between physical inactivity and various health outcomes. And so one of the first classic studies was the London Transit Study. And this study came out in 1953. And basically what it was looking at, it was comparing conductors on buses to drivers. Right? And the idea was that these conductors were pretty active through the course of the day, and the bus drivers were basically just sitting. Right? So this was a 2-year study, and they looked at various health outcomes there. There was another study done around 1970, much larger study. You can see there were about, well, I shouldn't say larger. This was actually a little smaller study, but it went for a longer period of time, 16-year study. And so they followed these people, and what they were looking at is they were looking at longshoremen in San Francisco. And they were looking at various levels of activity. So you had people who had desk jobs and people who sort of had lighter activities, maybe the drivers of trucks and things on the docks there. And then you had the people who were doing really the heavy lifting. Right? And again, they were looking at various health outcomes there. And then there was a third study, and this was Harvard alumni study, which came out in the late 70s. And this was a study where they sent out surveys to Harvard alumni. They went all the way back, I think, from 1915, found people who were still alive, basically asking them questions: how much activity you do, how much time do you sit around every day, those sorts of things. And so the bottom line here with all of these studies was that what they seemed to show is the people who were least active were the ones who had the highest incidence of things like heart attacks and deaths from a variety of causes. And so these were some really big studies. There were a number of other studies that basically were showing the same thing. Now, one thing you have to understand about these studies is that these are all observational studies, right? And they have lots of flaws in them. These studies really aren't taking into account things like people's diets and, you know, how much stress they're under and all kinds of things. right? So you could find flaws in a lot of these studies. I mean, the really, truly way to see what's happening is you'd have to do a actual experimental study where you take groups and you give them treatment and then have some kind of control. Very hard to do with this. So we have to use sort of these large-scale observational studies. But the general tendency is to find that physical inactivity is not is not particularly good for you. Now, this was an interesting study. This was done by Stephen Blair back in 1996. You can see about 32,000 people. This study included men and women. And what he was looking at was taking healthy versus what he would call unhealthy people. Right? And these unhealthy people had underlying risk factors. For example, they had hypertension, or they might have high cholesterol levels, things of that nature. They were smokers. And what he looked at was their level of fitness, okay, and from a low, moderate, and high. He broke these people up into 3 classifications and looked at the death rates here. And what he found was that if you take a look at the unhealthy people, that as people had higher levels of fitness, their death rates were dropping. Okay? And this was very interesting because what this is showing is that even if you have some kind of underlying health issue, that if you exercise, that this is going to reduce your risk of dying from a variety of causes, by the way. And also what's interesting here is if you take a look at what happens to these healthy people who didn't really have any underlying health problems, with an increasing level of fitness, you also saw a reduction in risk, but up to a point. So once you got beyond a moderate level of fitness, the extra exercise didn't really seem to help you all that much more. So, you know, we've heard this, that moderate levels of exercise are good, and there's sort of a point of diminishing returns from a health standpoint. Okay, so that was kind of an interesting study. Now, if we sort of fast forward into the 2000s, this was a large scale study. You can see that there's over 800,000 people involved with this. And this type of study is what's called a meta-analysis. And what they do here is the researchers go in and they look at all of the previous studies that have been done. And they sort of sift through all these studies. They try to pick out the best studies based upon their specific criteria. And then they can analyze those studies together and to try to come out with some kind of conclusion. So these are nice studies to have. So you can see here, it's not real important that you actually see what's going on here, but lots and lots of studies, and the basic result from this was that with physical activity, people who are more physically active, there seemed to be, on average, about a 35% reduction in a person's risk in terms of something like death from cardiovascular disease, primarily heart attack. And if you look at death from all causes, there was about a 33% reduction. That's pretty powerful stuff. Okay? Now again, these studies are all observational studies, so they're circumstantial evidence, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence here. And most of these studies are basically telling us the same sort of thing. Now again, there's some problems with these big types of meta-analyses because what happens in terms of scientific research is a lot of times studies that don't find results don't get published. And so you don't know. You know, sometimes it's important to know that nothing's happened. But, so there's a little bit of selection bias here. But again, I think there's a lot of evidence sort of pointing towards this idea that inactivity is not good for us. But all of these studies that I sort of mentioned, the thing that they weren't specifically looking at was sitting behavior and what we call sedentary behavior. They were just looking at different levels of activity. They weren't specifically looking at sitting. And you'll see the term sedentary behavior. And what I mean by that is it includes things like sitting, and you could be sitting watching television, you could be sitting at your desk working, just sort of lounging around, basically not doing very much of anything. Okay? So right now you're engaged in sedentary behavior. Okay? So that's what we want to look at now. And that's the whole issue, is how bad is really just sitting. Okay? And so here's a quote. This is by Mike Royko. Some of you might, from the Midwest, might recognize the name. I think he was a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he's basically saying, hey, don't run if you can walk, don't walk if you can sit, and don't sit if you can lie down. Okay? And apparently, we're taking his advice quite well. Okay? And if you take a look at the statistics and you look at the amount of time spent in sedentary behavior, and this is done by age and by gender, you could get the general idea that if you're over the age of about 11, you are spending over 50% of your time sitting basically on your butt. Okay? That's what that's telling us, and you can see here, once you sort of get over 40, and I think that's most of us in the room here, that things don't get any better. We tend to sit even more. Now, there's another question here, and we could probably use this for another lecture, is that necessarily the case? Does that really have to be? This is just looking at sort of averages, but does that really have to happen? And that's in itself sort of an interesting question. And so when you start looking at the amount of actual time spent in what we would call sedentary behavior, and this is while you're awake. We're not talking about what happens while you sleep. We're just talking about what happens while you're awake. This is what we see for the distribution. And so the average person is spending a little bit over 9 hours every day in sedentary behavior. And what the statistics tell us is that on average, people are spending about 3 hours a day watching television. That's the average adult in the United States. Okay? So to me, that's kind of amazing that we're doing that much TV watching. And if we take a look at things like what we call low-intensity activity, we're spending maybe about 6.5 hours a day doing that. Low-intensity activity is just sort of the activities of daily living. You get up, you move around, you brush your teeth, you go do all the little things around the house and whatever you're doing to move around. We're only spending about 40 minutes a day in what would be called moderate to intense or vigorous activity. And so this would be, for example, if you have to walk up a flight of steps. All right, or maybe you're carrying a heavy bag of groceries from your car. That would be sort of activities of daily living. Some of us might even regularly exercise. Unfortunately, not enough of us are. But that would fall into that classification. But you can see it takes up a very, very small slice of the pie here. Okay? And what I think is sort of interesting, and this is sort of a little side note, is what happens to people who, let's say, regularly exercise. You guys are here, most of you are regularly exercising, and the question is, what happens to you after you finish exercising? Okay? What do you do? How much energy are you expending once you finish? Right? And what this research shows, and this is pretty recent research, just in the last few years, that there's a tendency for people who engage in this moderate to vigorous activity, that once they finish, the rest of the day, they tend to do less. Okay? And so, in effect, you're almost subverting yourself, because we tend to think, hey, I'm going to the gym, I'm going to work out, I'm going to burn off all of these calories, right? And then what happens, you get home and you say, I did my work for the day, I need some quality me time. And what happens is you sit down on the couch all day, where maybe you would have gone out and done something in the garage, or you run some errands, or you're doing something physically active. You say, nah, I'm not going to do that today. I'll wait. How many people are guilty of that? I know I am. I've done more times than I care to think about. So that's a kind of interesting phenomenon. And so what ends up happening is that even if you're doing the right thing, right, what tends to happen is that as a result of that, there tends to be a shift from these low intensity activities that you sort of do through the course of the day, and now you're shifting to more sedentary type of activity, which I think is very interesting, and I don't think most people are really aware of. So that's something, again, we can talk about in another lecture. So the question then is, wait a second, I like to sit. It feels good. What's really the problem here? What's the harm in sitting? And so we can look at it a couple of ways. One is just purely anatomical, and what happens to you when you sit for long periods. And it turns out that, in many cases, when you're sitting for prolonged periods, you think about sitting at a desk, working at the office in front of the computer, is that, we tend to have poor posture. Right? And this could be if you're, reclining on the couch watching TV or at your desk, whatever it is. And, if you're in a position like this, right, and you can see the posture is not very good, you've got this curved spine, it should be more erect, that just the weight of your head, okay, the average head weighs about 10 pounds, okay, so think about this bowling ball, right, sitting there, and you've got the force of gravity acting downward on it, right? And so that would be like if I take this bowling ball and I put it on a dowel, right, and I have it sitting there, and I've got it perfectly upright, the forces gravity are running right through that dowel, right? And if you had your hand on this thing and you had it perfectly upright, it'd be very easy to keep it balanced, right? But if I just tilt that dowel with the bowling ball just a little bit, it would be like leaning my head forward here. And I get out of position, and now it's going to take me a lot of effort. I've got to use a lot of muscle to keep that dowel straight up, and the same thing happens with our spine. And so we put a lot of force on our spine when we get into this position. And again, we're spending a lot of time, as you saw in the previous slides, probably in this type of position. Right? So what ends up happening is that you start to see problems in the neck, shoulder, and back region, things like muscle strains, as a result, because you're basically causing the muscles to work harder than they really need to. All right, that's a problem. It causes disc problems, and I'll show you this more in the next slide, but really creates a lot of pressure in the lower spine. We can develop weak abdominal muscles from this kind of position. Things like tight hips, so you start to lose your flexibility in that area, and even things like poor circulation from just sitting for very prolonged periods. So lots of problems with this. Now, of course, if you sit there for just a little bit and you get up, it's not a big thing, but if you're spending hours and hours every day, week after week, month after month, doing this, then potentially you could develop some long-term problems, because your body will sort of adapt to this kind of position. Okay, so certainly, you know, learning proper posture is going to help a little bit, but we still have this issue of sitting. And this is kind of interesting when you look at the amount of pressure in an area like the lumbar spine. Right? And everything's going to run through, all the forces are going to run through that particular area, and this is where people have a lot of low back problems. When you look at the amount of pressure that is produced, here we have lying down. This is standing, okay, and this is standing with good posture, upright posture. This is sitting. You actually, when you sit, even if you were sitting in the correct position, the amount of pressure on the low back is higher than if you were standing. And if you are sitting in a forward position, you know, so that bad posture position, the pressure on the spine is even higher. Okay, so just anatomically, when we talk about the effects of sitting, there are problems there. Okay. Now, another thing that we can look at here is what happens from a physiological perspective. Right? And this is a quote from a physician in Australia, and he's saying the most striking feature of prolonged sitting is the absence of skeletal muscle contractions, right? Particularly in the very large muscles of the lower limbs. Right? So you might say, well, why is that a problem? Well, it turns out that number one, if you want to expend a lot of energy, you want to use large muscle groups. And the muscle groups that are considered pretty large in our body are things like the muscles in the back, the hips, the legs. Those are big muscle groups. And so if you're sitting around most of the day doing nothing, overall caloric expenditure drops. So just purely from a weight management standpoint, that's going to be a problem. Okay? But the other thing here that people are finding, which is very, very important, is the effect on regulating metabolism, in particular regulating your blood glucose levels. And that's important because if you don't regulate your blood glucose levels properly and blood glucose levels get too high, you could develop diabetes. And that's a growing problem here in the United States. So what happens is that if you are active and you move around, this goes a long way in terms of helping to regulate your insulin levels and your blood sugar levels as well. We need that movement. We need those large muscle groups to use up some of that glucose for energy. Otherwise, we're going to start overproducing insulin, and if we do that for a long enough period of time, this starts to create problems in our body which helps to contribute to diseases like type 2 diabetes. So that's a big issue. Now, what does the research specifically say about sitting now? What's so bad? You know, we talked a little bit about the possibilities here, but what is really so bad about sitting? This is a study done just a few years ago in Australia. See a pretty large study, adults, and they were looking at television viewing behavior. You know, as we saw in a previous slide, we tend to spend a lot of time watching television. And so what they found is that people who watch TV for 6 hours or more live on average about 4 years less than people who didn't watch any TV. Okay? Quite a bit. Okay. Now, for those of you who are statistically minded, I threw in the 95% confidence intervals here. So the range is anywhere from 11 hours up to 10.8 years, which is kind of a wide range. Okay. But what I like about these statistics is they'll break it down by the minutes, right? So what they're basically saying here is for every hour of TV you watch after the age of 25, it reduces your life expectancy by 21.8 minutes. That's almost 22 minutes. So, yeah, so I love when they do stuff like this. And I think the statisticians like to do it, I think mainly to sort of drive home a point. People can relate to that a little bit better. So how does that compare? Well, if you take a look at risk associated with other types of diseases, and you take a look at physical inactivity and things like obesity and smoking, that these numbers are actually comparable. And if you take a look, what some of the studies say about smoking is that if you smoke one cigarette, that's going to take 11 minutes off of your life. Right? So again, these are all statistical type studies. You have to, take these with a little grain of salt. But I think the message here is that there seems to be some evidence to say, that this sitting is not so good. Right? And when you compare it to other types of problems, it's at least on par, maybe even worse. All right. But here's my question. I want to know what's going to kill me faster. Watching 1 hour of Fox News or binge watching Game of Thrones. So Dr. Dahlman will have to work on that particular project. So anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting study. Now, this was the study that sort of prompted that LA Times article that I showed you at the very beginning of the talk. And so, again, this is one of these big meta-analysis. In this case, they looked at 47 different studies. And so here, what they found, and they were specifically looking at sedentary behavior. What they did in this study is they're able to factor out physical activity. That's a separate entity from the sedentary behavior. So we can kind of statistically manipulate this to do that. And you can see here the results. So if you look at things like cancers and cardiovascular disease, that the risk of sitting is going to be somewhat greater than people who are going to be doing something. Okay, so the people who tend to sit more have bigger problems. And you can see here that the closest association, the biggest risk, was for developing type 2 diabetes. Right? So people who were sitting were at a 90% greater risk. Okay? And that seems to make sense from what we had talked about regarding the physiology and the regulating blood glucose. Right? So even though this might be some circumstantial evidence, it seems to fit in to what we think might be happening. So this is what I thought. This is what really grabbed my attention in this article. Is they looked at people who were exercising, right? And what they found is that even if you regularly exercise, but you spend most of the day sitting around, you were at about a 16% higher risk of basically dying from a variety of causes compared to somebody who is more active. Okay.
So how much should we sit? I know.
Well, that is the $1 million. That's the $1 million question, right? That's the big question. And so this is, and you're right on target here, because what are the countermeasures for this? How much should I sit? What should I do? All right. Now, it turns out that there's actually some good news in all of this. And there were a couple of studies, again, these pretty recent. One came out in 2012. One just hit the newsstand. I mean, this was in April of this year. And similar types of studies. And what they found is that if you break up the sitting, say, and it doesn't take much, maybe 2 to 3 minutes every 20 or 30 minutes per hour or so, that this is going to have some benefits in terms of helping to regulate your insulin levels and blood glucose levels. So from that perspective, there seems to be some benefits, and it seems that the more breaks you take, the more benefit you're going to see. So what these studies are showing is that it really doesn't take a lot of doing something, as long as you can break up that sitting every so often. So, but we still don't know, what's the optimal level. And so what you see are people doing stuff like this. And here is our, fearless leader, Emily, in the back there working at her desk, and she's got one of these adjustable desk type setups. This is one of our faculty members, and he set up something. I don't know if he dug this stuff out of the dumpster, but he kind of set up his own thing. Yeah. So he just grabbed some boxes. I walked into his office. I said, I've got to take a picture of this. This is pretty funny. And then this guy, I have no idea who this guy is, but people use even these fancy office treadmills.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so there have actually been a study or two looking at this phenomenon, and what they find is that by trying to do these sorts of things, standing more at work, and if you're on the treadmill or whatever, that it does cut down sedentary time. So in an 8-hour day, on average, people might reduce their sedentary activity on the job by maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours. But the question goes back to what you were asking is, well, how much do we know? How much should we be doing this? And nobody knows the answer to that yet. If I did this all day long versus if I just took a break every 2 or 3 minutes, am I really going to see much of a difference? That's sort of the open question, and I'm sure somebody is going to be working on that if they're not doing it already. But again, I think the bottom line here is we know, the evidence is sort of piling up that if we sit for long periods, it's not good, and if we take breaks, it's going to be helpful for us. All right? So we can look at just some very simple measures, and here are just 10 simple things that you might do, strategies to increase your activity. And again, one is to take a break from the computer every 20 to 30 minutes. I have a couple of things in my office that I use. I have this sort of metal pole here, and I have one of the stretch bands. And so, when I'm not flogging students with those, occasionally I use them for exercise. And so, I spend a lot of time staring into a screen every day, and I try, the best I can to get up, do something. Sometimes I'll do this, sometimes I do some other things. If you're at home, just do something else during commercials. I try wash dishes or, go do the lawn, throw a load of laundry and get up, move around, do something. As long as you're not running to the refrigerator, grabbing your beer and sitting down. All right. Now, you could use something like the adjustable height desk that you saw, that Emily was using, so you can sort of transition between standing and sitting, taking breaks during long meetings. People hear lots of meetings, so sometimes it's good to take a break. Stand during phone calls. I think many of you in here can remember the good old days where you actually had a phone on a wall somewhere in the house, and you actually had to get up and go answer that phone, right? And there was actually a study done a while back that looked at that, and they saw that, you know, over the course of a year, going back and forth and answering a phone like that, you walk the equivalent of close to 2 miles just doing that in your house. Okay, small amount of activity over a year, but all of those little things add up, right? You know, the remote control, again, there are people in here, and I'm one of them. Remember sort of the days before remote controls. You actually had to get up and turn the channel. And when you did, there was a knob that you had to turn. And if you went from channel 2 to channel 13, it took some work. You were actually using your muscles to do that. Now I can talk on the phone and sit on my couch and change channels, and I use a finger to do all of that, right? So just little things like that, right? If you're at work, you can get up out of your desk, you know, instead of emailing. I try to do that as well. Things like using stairs rather than elevators, or park further away. You know, I see this all the time with friends. We go somewhere, and you know, they're going to look for that very closest parking space, and there's a parking space 100 feet away, right? You know, you got a whole row open, but no, they're going for that one space, and they'll wait 5 minutes for that space. You know, to me, it's always kind of crazy, right? Things like using the bathroom. Again, this is something I try to do. Is I'll walk to another building and try to use the bathroom, and then just use reminders. I thought this was sort of a handy thing. What you can do is, with the calendar functions now, you know, you can set up a repeating reminder. Take you 5 minutes to do, and you could set this up so, you know, for the entire year, and it'll just remind you every hour, hey, get up, stretch a couple of minutes. You know, so that's kind of a interesting thing. So there's lots of things that you can do. These little things that add up in the course of the day. So the idea is that we move away from spending more time in the sedentary behavior to that lighter level of activity, and that's going to seem to help us. Right. So just to sort of summarize things here, and getting back to the original question, is sitting really the new smoking? So here's what we can basically say, that even though, you know, many of these studies that we looked at are observational in nature, and this is sort of circumstantial evidence, but there, I think, is an accumulating amount of this evidence to say that there are certainly negative effects associated with sitting in sedentary behavior. And that this is independent of the level of physical activity that you're at, or your level of fitness. All right? And the risks that are associated with sitting seem to be on par, possibly even more, than what we see for other types of problems. Another thing is that we need to have some better studies. You know, and this goes back to that question as well: how long should we be sitting? You know? So, what can we get away with? That's another thing. And the last thing is that we see that there are a number of countermeasures, or things that you can do to increase your level of activity. You know, and I find it kind of interesting when I sit back and I think about all of this stuff. I said, you know, we sort of have this deal with the devil. And what we've sort of created for ourselves is a situation where we have all of this food. You know, I tell my students this: I can walk within probably 50 yards of here. I can get food. Right? There's a Coke machine. There's something. There's food everywhere. So we have plenty of food. That's not a problem. And we've created sort of all of these labor-saving devices. All of these things we have. So what do we have to do? Well, now we have to go to a place like this, and we have to get on a treadmill, And we have to exercise, and we're sort of going nowhere very quickly. And we have to force ourselves to think about doing all of those little things I just mentioned that we never ever had to think about before. Now we have to sort of force ourselves to do just those little things. So we have, everything we want, but there's a price to pay, and the price to pay is our health. And what do we do about it? So I think that's all very, very, very interesting. And there's lots of other things that we can talk about. So I'll leave it here. I thought this was sort of an interesting quote from Will Rogers. Even if you're on the right track, you will get run over if you just sit there. So I think that's a nice way to sum things up. So thanks for attending. If you have any questions,
Can you undo any damage that's been done? I mean, is there...
In a lot of cases, you can. And the thing is that it's really never too late to start. So certain things, if you have underlying coronary artery disease, there might not be a whole lot you can do. You can maybe slow things down a little bit. Things like high blood sugar levels and all of that, like 2 diabetes, are ways that you could mitigate that through the activity. So there's lots of things that can be done. And, I'm just a huge advocate of it. I wouldn't be standing here in front of you if I didn't believe, wholeheartedly in activity, in the benefits.
When I was working, the employees had a thing on the computer that would come up every hour that would say, stand up and relax. And they also had a walking track. They walked around the building at lunchtime.
Yeah.
So that plus they would encourage people, instead of taking the elevators up to the second or third floor, to walk up the steps every time they left to go to another floor or went to go to lunch.
Yeah, and that's a great idea that on a company level that they were able to implement that.
I wonder as exercise professionals if we have done the population a bit of a disservice. That we've always regulated it's got to be between 70 and 85% max heart rate. It's got to be at least 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's got to be at this intensity, or you don't get benefits.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if you can't do that, then I might as well not bother, and I'm just going to stay in this.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Is we tend to be really hung up with the numbers. And those of you who are working on the classes and you've got your heart rate monitors on and the numbers flashing, and people really get caught up with all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And what you have to do is you have to be able to separate the health benefits of physical activity versus the fitness benefits. There's an overlap there, but they are really kind of two different sorts of things. So the idea is that if you are physically active, even at a lower intensity, that this is going to provide you with health benefits. So for example, if I go out on a walk, it's not going to help my level of fitness very much if that's all that I really do. Okay, but from a health standpoint, it's very beneficial to do that. And I think there's enough research to tend to back that up. So we have to separate that stuff out. And I remember Karen gave a talk a couple of years ago on exercise as medicine. And I always liked that because, one of these things she said is, you can't find a pill that does everything that physical activity does. And that's part of what we're talking about. And so when you come here and you work out and you do all these sorts of things, I think in the long run you really are doing yourselves a lot of good, and it'd be nice if more people did it. And I think, if you think of sort of bigger picture and healthcare costs and get into all of those sorts of things, sedentary activity, either directly or indirectly, costs billions and billions and billions of dollars in healthcare costs. There's a lot of things we can prevent, a lot of health problems. People become more physically active.
one of the things I've noticed is that people feel that it's either all or none. And one of the problems with all is that you do have problems, people who all of a sudden decide they're going to walk 2 or 3, 4 or 5 miles right away, and they end up getting foot problems instead of working up to it.
Right.
Shows like Dancing with the Stars, where they look great, but you have anywhere from 1 to 4 injuries a year from overdoing it in a short period of time.
Yeah.
So I think the takeaway message, at least for me, is that you want to get to that goal, but you need to work up to it instead of saying you're going from 0 to 100 in an hour or a week.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Is you really have to approach this with baby steps. But I think that's one of the reasons why you come to a facility like this. You have the people who are trained, who know how to put people on programs, and that's very, very helpful and very beneficial. A lot of people, and I see this all the time, is they get very gung-ho, and they say, I'm going to start exercising, and they come in, and then 2 weeks later they disappear. And a lot of it is because, they start out, and typically they start out trying to do too much too soon, and either they're not accustomed to that sort of feeling of discomfort, or maybe they get the soreness, they don't like that. And there's a lot of reasons why people drop out, but one of the big reasons is they basically are trying to do too much. And, what we're seeing is that you don't even have to come to a place like this. Is there's stuff you can do around the house in your daily activity, or daily things to increase your level of physical activity, to improve your health. So doing the organized exercise and all that is wonderful. All kinds of benefits to it. But it's those little things that count too. And now what the research is saying is that, even if you're in good shape, this sedentary activity is bad. And there's some other evidence. There's actually experimental evidence looking at the long-term effects of things like bed rest, which is sort of a classic sedentary activity. And when studies are taking people and for various periods of time, sat them in a bed, and they can't get out of bed for sometimes a couple of months. Imagine volunteering for that kind of experiment. And what they find is that your level of fitness, your health just sort of drops off like a cliff. And even in the short term, if you are inactive, if you take a break from your regular exercise, that your fitness drops off very, very quickly. And so this low level of fitness, this sedentary activity, is sort of almost the rock bottom, other than lying flat.
Especially in the aging population. A day in bed for an older person is like a week in bed for a younger person.
Yeah, and that's, and then the older you get, I think the more you have to really think about this stuff. And it's almost like you have to work a little bit harder, push yourself a little bit more. And the hard thing, with all of this stuff is really what you're doing when you're trying to incorporate this stuff is making lifestyle changes. And that's the hardest thing for people, is to make that change. But once you do it, if you do it for several months, then it starts to become ingrained.
Yeah.
But it's taking that effort and that due diligence to do it, and that's the tough part for a lot of people. You guys are different. You're here, I'm sort of preaching to the choir in that respect.
Yeah, but when we go home now, we know.
Well, now you go home and
I don't get that break.
To do those little extra things. So.
This is great. What about a stationary bike? You're sitting.
Yeah, stationary bike's fine. Yeah.
But you're still sitting.
Yeah,
While you're
those are fine. Yeah, and so you're still moving, you're still activating the muscle and all that. So, it's a really good exercise. So, and again, it's sort of, what is the intent? Because I could, if I'm setting up an exercise program for somebody, and for example, I want somebody to lose weight, that's one kind of program. But if I have somebody that wants to train for a triathlon, it's a completely different program. But I'm using physical activity in both. It's just how I apply those. You know, so you really have to look at the intent, what are the goals and all those things. But something like a bike is fine. All right. So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I was expecting a standing ovation.
If you could fill out an email for us, that would be fantastic. Please.
Share that one. Oh wait, no. The 10th.
Oh, the 10th.
You know what I started to do? What is that?
Open my car door with a key rather than push the button.
I taught her along.
I think it's the little things that we can.
Yeah, that's right.
They do. Yeah.
It's a miracle on Hawaii.
Yes, record something and then you're
I'm thinking so
much
that whole thing of doing a disservice by
I know, but you know what? Those shows were I think that's that more when I work with
you stand there. Yes, I noticed them.
Is it better than
Yeah.
get a walk around?
So every step I take, by the end of the day, I go, I did it or not. And if I'm taking that step, I'm like, right, who's gonna, yeah, that was